there's been a slight upsurge in the past couple of years of Church of England, or Anglican more generally. But certainly the Christian other, so this would include the mainstream denominations, people who just say just Christian, really, and a vast number of other kind of denominations, or they perhaps wouldn't even see themselves as denominations. That's been growing quite steadily over that period. I think part of the effect may simply just be people who, for a period, would have been slightly more likely than not to take no religion, now have kind of reverted back to a kind of a cultural Christianity. People who are still regarding themselves as having been brought up religious, the likelihood is that they're from the stronger Christian families, because they're the ones who are still getting their kids baptized and taking them to church schools and that kind of stuff. And so the likelihood is that what we're seeing is a kind of a minority effect of a slight resurgence of the more Christian families producing smaller numbers of more committed Christians, who then, the ones they then meet at church, are in a similar boat because they've been swimming against the tide in the wider culture in their schools, and then they encourage each other. So what we're probably seeing is that there's better opportunity for younger people to sustain themselves, and of course there's been a huge amount of new evangelistic efforts in the past 20 years, what gets called the new evangelization in the Catholic world. All kinds of things in the Church of England that come under fresh expressions, messy churches. And there's a real attempt to reach out to people. But also there's a lot of initiatives aimed at people with young families. I mean, I've got 2 young kids myself, and messy churches, and there's all sorts of things that churches are doing precisely to kind of, reach out to these lost sheep, if you like. I wasn't baptized, I grew up with no religion, and then I became a Catholic in my mid-20s. So there was a slow intellectual movement from atheism to Catholicism. And at the same time, again, I was spending time with Catholics, I was drinking beer with Catholics, I was hanging out with them, and this socialization and this kind of being brought into a particular community was happening at the same time. Is that against the bigger picture of 50, 60 years of growing decline, and especially this baby boom generation, who for all sorts of interesting and complex reasons tended to drop off religious practice. If you look at some of the graphs, I mean, there's a real watershed that happens at people born after 1945. It was a baby boom. There's lots of them. So it's very difficult for little pockets of Latin mass adherents or small, mostly immigrant communities to show up in the kind of data sets that we're using for the big picture. So the British Social Attitude Survey isn't going to pick these up. And the census, which would, only asks one question about religion that's very generic and only has a single Christian box and doesn't ask about practice.